Hey there, this is Michelle and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 32, is about Canada's war with the United States. This will be part 2 of this series on the War of 1812. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. We saw that the War of 1812 started as Napoleon waged his war of conquest on Europe, and that the War of 1812 was the North American phase of this same conflict. We saw that Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the Americans to raise funds for his conquest of Europe. We also saw that there was a race to the Pacific coast from the interior. And then, on June 18, 1812, the United States of America declared war on Great Britain and began to make immediate plans for the conquest of Canada. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the War in Upper Canada first and how the Americans approached their objective. The good news for Canada was that the Americans were poorly organized. One issue was that many of the American militia units refused to cross state lines. Another issue was that instead of concentrating their forces and attacks, the Americans opted for a scattered, multi-pronged approach. And probably the worst of all for the Americans was that they would come up against two master tacticians, Brock and Tecumseh. In Upper Canada, Isaac Brock was in charge of defending the colony. He was a brilliant strategist and an inspiring leader. Historian Desmond Morton said, quote, "While some historians denounce the theory that great men make much difference in history, it's hard to see how Upper Canada would have resisted invasion without Isaac Brock." End quote. Brock wanted to take the battle to the Americans instead of waiting for them to attack. He wanted to keep the American attackers off balance, and Canada's native allies would play a crucial role. The great Shawnee chief Tecumseh, with the help of his half-brother Tenskwatawa, created a pan-Native alliance. The Native alliance brought together Shawnee, Ottawa, Delaware, Miami, Wyandot, Chippewa, Fox, Potawatomi, Dakota, Kickapoo, Sauk, and Winnebago nations. The Native alliance was united in the common goals of 1. To stop American expansion into Native territory, and 2. To secure a sovereign First Nations homeland in the interior. So the First Nations fought alongside the British more for tactical reasons than out of loyalty. On July 12, 1812, American General William Hull led 2,500 men out of Detroit on the northwest tip of Lake Erie across from present-day Windsor, Ontario, into Upper Canada. The invasion had begun. Oddly enough, Hull was confident that the Canadians would flock to the American side. Well, the Americans did know what hit them. At the American post on Mackinac Island at the northern tip of Lake Huron, the Americans awoke surrounded by British regulars, French-Canadian voyageurs, and some 300 native warriors. The American fort surrendered without firing a shot. In the south, Canadian Isaac Brock focused on Detroit. The American General Hull was behind the garrison walls, and the Americans were terrified of the natives. Both Brock and Tecumseh used this to their advantage. Brock sent a fake communique along the enemy lines, knowing that the Americans would get it. It said that all he needed were 5,000 more natives to finalize the assault on Detroit. The Americans did intercept the communique and were terrified. At the same time, Tecumseh had his warriors march along the tree line outside the range of American fire, darting in and out of the trees. Then the warriors at the front of the line would step into the trees and run to the back of the line to continue marching. The Americans counted over 3,000 native warriors when there were actually less than 600. A great move by Tecumseh. American General Hull was terrified of an Indian massacre, and after just a few cannon shots and a threatening ultimatum from Brock, Detroit surrendered on August 16, 1812. Fort Dearborn, now Chicago, had also fallen, and with the capture of Detroit and the fort on Mackinac Island, the Americans suffered the greatest loss of territory in their history. The Canadians and their allies had taken the entire western frontier. These successes spirited volunteers in Upper Canada to sign up to join the defense of their colony. And up till then, the neutral Iroquois too joined the British side. They were led by the Mohawk leaders John Norton and John Brant, the son of Joseph Brant. As an aside, Joseph Brant, who died in November of 1807, was a Mohawk and political leader based in present-day New York. He was closely associated with Great Britain during and after the American Revolution. Brock was eventually killed a few months later, leading a heroic charge up to Queenston Heights on the Canadian side of the Niagara River. Tecumseh too died in battle the following year at Moraviantown near present-day Chatham, Ontario. By November of 1812, the Americans had won control of Lake Ontario, and by the spring of 1813, a fleet of American ships landed at York, present-day Toronto. With more than 1,700 American soldiers overwhelming York, the British fled and York was lost, burned, and looted. And then there was Laura Secord, and no, not the same Laura Secord as the chocolates, as they are not related to the real Laura Secord. Laura was a pioneer and a mother of 5. Her husband was wounded at the Battle of Queenston Heights and left for dead. Laura went to the battlefield, found him, and took him home. She was nursing him back to health when the Americans took command of their homestead. Laura overheard the American officers discussing plans for a surprise attack at Beaver Dams, present-day Thorold, Ontario. She bravely undertook a 32-kilometer trek across the war zone to warn the British. She climbed the Niagara Escarpment, her feet bleeding, where the Mohawk sentries took her to see Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon, who then set up an ambush at Beaver Dams. At Beaver Dams, the Mohawk war cries terrified the Americans into surrender, and almost 500 Americans were taken prisoner. 2 weeks earlier at Stony Creek, the American invasion was stopped. Now here at Beaver Dams, it was turned back. Well, that's it for this episode. Let's summarize. In this episode, we saw that the Americans were poorly organized and that Isaac Brock teamed up with Native allies led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. And on July 12, 1812, American General William Hull led 2,500 men out of Detroit into Upper Canada. Also that the Americans surrendered their fort on Mackinac Island without firing a shot. And on August 16, 1812, Detroit surrendered to Brock and Tecumseh, and Fort Dearborn, now Chicago, had also fallen. We saw the Mohawk of the Iroquois Confederacy, led by John Norton and John Brant, joined with the British. We also saw that Brock died at the Battle of Queenston Heights, and that Tecumseh died a year later at Moraviantown, and that the Americans successfully took York, present-day Toronto, in the spring of 1813. And we saw Laura Secord warn the British that the Americans were planning a surprise attack at Beaver Dams, and that British Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon set up an ambush at Beaver Dams and turned back the American attack. Okay, with the summary out of the way, please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 33, where we look into the War of 1812, part 3. Here we'll look at the war in Lower Canada. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.